The scream came first, sharp and sudden, cutting through the marble hallway of the Cross mansion like a blade through silk. Elena Voss dropped the tray she was carrying. Glasses shattered across the floor, but she did not look down. She was already running. A small boy, 5 years old, had broken free from her hand only seconds earlier. He had darted between two guards, slipped past a housekeeper carrying folded linens, and now stood frozen in the middle of the grand hallway, staring up at the tallest, coldest man Elena had ever worked for. Damien Cross, the Alpha King, that was what people called him, though never to his face. Owner of Cross Industries, a man whose name alone could end careers, cancel deals, and silence entire boardrooms with a single glance. He had just stepped out of his private elevator, phone pressed to his ear, voice low and commanding, as he closed a deal worth more money than Elena would make in 10 lifetimes. And then he stopped talking. Leo, her son, stood directly in his path, tiny fists clenched at his sides, chin tilted up with the fearless confidence that only children possess. He was not afraid of the tall man in the dark suit. He was not afraid of the guards moving toward him. He looked straight into Damien Cross's eyes, and in a voice that rang clear through the entire hallway, he said the words that would change everything. "You're my daddy." For a moment, nothing moved. The guards froze mid-step. The housekeeper stopped breathing. Even the ticking of the grand clock at the end of the hallway seemed to pause, as if the whole house were holding its breath along with everyone inside it. Damien Cross, a man who had negotiated with world leaders without blinking, who had once sat calmly across from a room full of lawyers trying to destroy his company and walked out victorious, stood completely still. His phone slipped slightly in his hand. The voice on the other end kept talking, but he no longer heard it. He looked down at the boy. Something about the child's face struck him like a fist to the chest. The shape of the eyes, the stubborn tilt of the jaw, a small dimple on the left cheek that appeared only when he smiled, though he was not smiling now, only staring up with open, trusting curiosity. "Leo," Elena's voice cracked as she finally reached them, scooping her son into her arms so quickly that his shoes nearly flew off. "I am so sorry, sir. He does not know what he is saying. He says that to every man he meets. He does not understand." She was lying, and badly. Leo had never once said those words to anyone else, not to the mailman, not to her brother, not to any of the men who occasionally visited the small apartment they shared. He had said it only once, and he had said it to this man, a stranger he had seen for less than 10 seconds. Damien did not answer her right away. He was still looking at the boy, who had buried his face shyly against his mother's shoulder now, peeking out with one curious eye. "What is your name?" Damien finally asked, his voice quieter than Elena had ever heard it. "Leo," the boy mumbled, half hidden. "Leo," Damien repeated, as if testing the weight of the word. Elena took a step back, pulling her son tighter against her chest. "We will leave immediately, sir. I understand if you want to end my employment. I am truly sorry for the disturbance." She turned to go, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain he could hear it. She had worked as a maid in this house for only 3 months. It was a good job, one of the few that paid enough to keep a roof over her son's head and food in his stomach. She could not afford to lose it, but she also could not afford for Damien Cross to look at her son the way he was looking at him now. "Wait." The single word stopped her cold. She turned back slowly. Damien had not moved from where he stood, but something in his posture had changed. The ice that usually surrounded him, the invisible wall that kept everyone at a careful distance, seemed to have cracked. Just slightly, just enough for something else to show through. "What is his birthday?" Damien asked. Elena's mouth went dry. "Sir, I really must get him to the staff quarters. It is past his birthday," Damien said again, and though his voice remained calm, there was something underneath it now, something that would not be denied. "March," Elena whispered. "The 14th of March." Damien's jaw tightened. He did the math instantly, the way he did math on every contract, every deal, every number that crossed his desk. 5 years and 9 months ago. He knew exactly what had happened 5 years and 9 months ago, on a rainy night he had tried very hard to forget. "I need to speak with you," he said. "Tonight. My study. 8 o'clock." It was not a request. Elena's arms tightened around her son, as fear rippled through her chest. She had spent 5 years building walls around this exact moment, hiding, moving from city to city, changing her surname, all to prevent this very conversation from ever happening. And now, in one careless instant, in one hallway, everything she had worked to protect stood on the edge of collapse. "Sir, I do not think that is necessary," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "Children say strange things. It means nothing." Damien's eyes moved from the boy back to her, and for the first time, he really looked at her. Truly looked. The tired eyes. The careful way she held herself, like someone who had learned to expect trouble at any moment. The faint scar above her eyebrow. A small gesture. The way she brushed a strand of hair behind her ear with her left hand, thumb briefly touching her earlobe. He had seen that gesture before. Years ago, from a woman whose name he never learned. 8 o'clock, he repeated, and this time his voice left no room for argument. Then he turned and walked away, his phone still pressed to his ear, though the call had long since disconnected and neither of them had noticed. Elena stood frozen in the hallway, Leo still clinging to her, until the housekeeper gently touched her arm. "Are you all right?" the older woman, Marta, asked softly. She had worked in the house for over a decade and had seen many strange things, but never anything quite like this. "I need to fix this," Elena whispered, more to herself than to Marta. "I need to fix this before it becomes something I cannot control." But even as she said the words, some small part of her, buried deep beneath years of fear, felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Relief, as if a weight she had carried alone for 5 years had suddenly, terrifyingly, become someone else's to share. She spent the rest of the afternoon in a daze, folding linens with hands that would not stop trembling, replaying the moment over and over. She had been so careful. She had taken this job under her mother's maiden name. She had kept Leo away from the main house as much as possible, only bringing him in on the rare occasions when her sister, who usually watched him, was unavailable. Today had been one of those rare occasions, and it had undone 5 years of careful hiding in less than 10 seconds. She thought about running. She had done it before. Pack a bag, take Leo, disappear into another city before nightfall. She had the skill for it now, the practiced calm of someone who had rebuilt her life from nothing more than once. But something stopped her this time. Perhaps it was exhaustion. Perhaps it was the way Leo had looked at Damien, not with fear, but with something like recognition, as if some small part of him, too young to understand anything at all, had known something his mother had spent 5 years trying to bury. By 7:45, she stood outside the heavy wooden doors of Damien Cross's private study, Leo's small hand wrapped in hers. She had debated leaving him with Marta, but something told her it would be better, safer even, to bring him. If Damien wanted answers, she would rather he see the boy again than imagine him. The door opened before she could knock. Damien stood on the other side, having clearly heard their footsteps approaching. He had changed out of his suit jacket, sleeves now rolled to his forearms, tie loosened. He looked less like the untouchable alpha king the business world feared, and more like a man who had spent the last several hours thinking very hard about something that troubled him deeply. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. The study was vast, lined with dark wood shelves filled with books that looked as though they had never been read, and a wall of windows overlooking the city lights below. Leo's eyes went wide at the sight of a large globe sitting near the window, and despite the tension in the room, he tugged gently at his mother's hand, wanting to explore. "He can look at it," Damien said, noticing. "It spins. He will not break anything." Elena hesitated, then let go of Leo's hand. The boy scampered toward the globe immediately, giving them a small window of privacy. "Please, sit," Damien said, gesturing toward one of 2 chairs positioned near the fireplace. Elena remained standing. "I would rather stand, sir." "Damien," he corrected. "Not sir, not here." She said nothing. He studied her for a long moment, the silence stretching between them like a held breath. "5 years ago," he finally said, "I was not the man I am now. I did not run this company. My father did. I was an architect, or trying to become one, working long hours for very little pay, living in a small apartment across the city." He paused. "One night there was a storm, a bad one. I was standing under the shelter at a bus stop, soaked through, waiting for a bus that never came." Elena's breath caught, but she said nothing. A woman was there too, Damien continued, his voice quieter now, almost distant, as if he were speaking to himself as much as to her. She had an umbrella that had turned inside out in the wind, completely useless. We laughed about it. I do not remember why it was funny. I only remember that it was, and that I had not laughed like that in a very long time. He looked directly at her now, and Elena felt the full weight of his gaze, 5 years of careful hiding beginning to crumble beneath it. We spent the night talking, he said, about nothing important, about everything. I told her things I had never told anyone. She never told me her name, and I never asked, because somehow, it did not seem to matter. In the morning, I received a call. My mother had collapsed. I left before she woke, thinking I would find her again once things settled. I never did. Elena's eyes had filled with tears she refused to let fall. Damien, tell me it was not you, he said, hitting her off, his voice suddenly rough. Tell me I am imagining things, that grief has made me see connections that are not real, and I will apologize for wasting your evening, and never speak of this again. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Across the room, Leo spun the globe with both hands, giggling softly at how fast it turned, completely unaware that his entire future was being decided in that very moment. Elena closed her eyes. When she opened them again, the tears had finally fallen. I cannot tell you that, she whispered. Because it would be a lie. The silence that followed was unlike any silence Damien Cross had ever experienced in his life, in boardrooms, in courtrooms, in hospital waiting rooms during the darkest week of his life. This silence was heavier than all of them combined, because in it lived 5 years of a truth he had never known existed. Is he mine? Damien asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena looked over at her son, who had abandoned the globe, and was now pressing his small hands against the cold window glass, watching the tiny cars move far below like glowing insects in the dark. I tried to find you, she said, instead of answering directly, the words spilling out now that the dam had finally broken. After that night, I went back to the bus stop every day for 2 weeks, hoping you would come back. I did not know your name either. I only knew you worked somewhere downtown, that you wanted to design buildings that made people feel less alone. I looked for you in ways that probably seemed crazy to anyone watching. And then I found out I was pregnant, and I stopped looking, because I was too afraid of what it would mean if I found you and you did not want us. Damien's hands had curled into fists at his sides, not out of anger at her, but at the years that had been stolen from him without his knowledge. You should have told me. I did not know how, Elena said, her voice breaking. And then circumstances made it impossible. What circumstances? She hesitated, glancing again at Leo, lowering her voice, even though the boy was clearly absorbed in the view outside the window. It does not matter right now. What matters is that you know the truth, and I will not lie to you about it. Leo is your son. I have known it since the day he was born, when he looked up at me with your eyes instead of mine. Damien moved toward the window then, standing beside his son without quite reaching for him, watching the small boy's reflection in the glass, overlapping strangely with his own. 5 years. 5 birthdays he had missed. 5 years of first words, first steps, first everything, gone, stolen by circumstances Elena had not yet fully explained. I am not angry with you, Damien said slowly, though his voice trembled slightly with the effort of controlling emotions he rarely allowed himself to feel. Not yet. I do not understand enough to be angry yet. But I need you to understand something. He turned to face her fully. Now that I know, I am not going anywhere. Whatever circumstances kept you from finding me, whatever fears kept you hiding these past months while working under my own roof, none of that matters anymore. I have a son, and I intend to be his father, starting tonight. Elena's legs felt weak beneath her, relief and terror crashing together in a wave she was not prepared for. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times over the years, in her darkest nights, in her loneliest mornings. She had imagined anger, she had imagined rejection. She had never quite allowed herself to imagine this, a quiet, fierce determination that asked for nothing except the chance to finally know his own child. There are things you do not know, she said carefully. Things that happened after that night, things that made staying away from you feel like the only safe choice I had. Damien's expression hardened slightly, not toward her, but toward whatever unknown force had made a mother believe hiding was safer than the truth. Then tell me." Before she could answer, small footsteps crossed the room, and Leo appeared beside them, tugging at Damien's sleeve, with the fearless persistence only children possess. "Mister," he said, looking up with wide, curious eyes, "do you really have a globe that spins? Can I see the fast part again?" Damien looked down at his son, really looked at him, and something in his chest that had been locked away for years, something guarded even from himself, finally began to loosen. "Yes," he said quietly, crouching down to the boy's height. "You can see the fast part again. As many times as you want." Elena watched them together, father and son, standing side by side for the very first time, and though 100 fears still crowded her mind, though the truth she had not yet told him waited like a storm on the horizon, for just a moment, she allowed herself to breathe. Tonight, the secret was finally out. Tomorrow, the real difficulties would begin. Morning came too quickly for Elena, who had spent most of the night lying awake in her small staff room, listening to Leo's steady breathing beside her, and turning the previous night's conversation over and over in her mind. She had told Damien the truth about Leo, but she had not yet told him everything, and the weight of what remained unspoken pressed against her chest like a stone. By the time the sun rose over the city, she had made a decision. She would tell him. Not all of it, not yet, but enough to explain why she had run, why she had hidden, why a mother who claimed to want the best for her child would choose poverty and secrecy over reaching out to the wealthy man who had fathered him. She did not get the chance that day. Damien left before dawn for a meeting that could not be rescheduled, and Elena spent the hours performing her usual duties with a mind that refused to settle. Every time she passed his study, she glanced at the closed door, wondering what he was thinking, whether he had already begun making plans that did not include her opinion. She did not have to wonder for long. That evening, as she finished tucking Leo into bed in the small staff quarters they shared, a knock sounded at the door. It was not Damien. It was his assistant, a sharp-eyed man named Marcus, who always seemed to be one step ahead of everyone around him. "Mr. Cross would like to see you," Marcus said, his tone polite, but carrying an unmistakable weight. "He asked that I stay with Leo while you speak with him, if that is all right." Elena hesitated, glancing back at her sleeping son. Marcus seemed kind enough, and something told her Damien would not have sent someone he did not trust completely. "He will not wake before I return?" she asked. "He rarely does, from what I have observed today," Marcus said with a small, reassuring smile. "Go. Mr. Cross does not like to be kept waiting, though tonight I suspect his patience will surprise you." Elena found Damien in the study again, though this time he was not standing by the window. He sat behind his large desk, papers spread out in front of him, though his attention was clearly elsewhere the moment she entered. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. This time, she did. "I spent the day thinking," Damien began, folding his hands together. "About Leo, about you, about the 5 years I lost, without knowing they existed." He paused. "I am not going to pretend I understand why you kept this from me. But I told myself I would listen before I judged, and I intend to keep that promise. So tell me, why did you run?" Elena took a deep breath, steadying herself the way she had steadied herself countless times before, whenever fear threatened to overwhelm her resolve. "After that night at the bus stop," she began, "I searched for you for 2 weeks, as I told you. I did not find you, and eventually life pulled me in other directions. When I discovered I was pregnant, I was frightened, but also strangely happy. I decided I would raise the child alone if I had to. I did not need you to be present to feel that this baby was already loved." She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing. "About 4 months into the pregnancy, I was approached by a woman. She introduced herself as someone connected to your family. She knew things about that night that only you or I could have known, which convinced me she was telling the truth about who she claimed to represent." Damien's expression darkened slightly. "Go on." "She told me that if I ever attempted to contact you, or to claim that the child was yours, my family would suffer for it. She mentioned my younger brother's education, which was being partly funded by a scholarship connected to a foundation I later learned was tied to your family's business interests. She mentioned my mother's medical bills. She made it very clear that she had the power to make my life, and the lives of the people I loved, extremely difficult if I did not disappear quietly. Damien's hands had curled into fists on the desk, his jaw tight with barely controlled anger, though none of it was directed at her. She offered me money, Elena continued, her voice growing steadier now that the truth was finally spilling out after years of silence. A significant amount, more than I had ever seen in my life. She said it was compensation, meant to help me start over somewhere new, as long as I agreed to certain conditions. I refused the money. I did not want to be paid to disappear, but I understood the threat behind the offer, and I was terrified. I had no proof of who she was working for beyond her own claims, and I had no resources to fight back against a family with your kind of influence. So I did the only thing I could think of. I left the city. I changed my surname to my mother's maiden name. I moved from place to place for the first 2 years, always careful, always watching over my shoulder, until eventually the fear started to fade into something more like caution. Damien sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing everything she had said. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and dangerous, in a way Elena had not heard before. "Describe her," he said. "The woman who approached you." Elena thought back carefully. She was older, perhaps in her 50s at the time, sharp features. She wore a great deal of expensive jewelry, and she spoke with the kind of confidence that made it clear she was used to people obeying her without question. She never told me her name directly, but she mentioned once, almost carelessly, that she had known your mother for many years. Something shifted in Damien's expression, a dawning recognition that filled him with a cold, quiet fury. "Regina," he said, more to himself than to Elena. "My aunt." Elena watched him carefully. "You know her?" "She has always believed my father made mistakes trusting people outside our social circle," Damien said, his voice tight with restrained anger. "After my father passed, she gained significant influence within the company and within our family. I knew she was manipulative. I did not know she was capable of something like this." He stood abruptly, pacing toward the window, his reflection ghost-like against the dark glass. 5 years, he said again, the words feeling heavier each time he repeated them. 5 years. I could have known my son. 5 years you spent living in fear, because my own family threatened you, and everyone you love. "I do not blame you for what happened," Elena said quietly. "I want you to understand that. I do not know if you were even aware something like this was happening at the time." "I was not," Damien said, turning back to face her, his eyes burning with an intensity that made Elena's breath catch. "But that does not make it my family's actions any less unforgivable. And it will not stop me from making this right." "What does that mean?" Elena asked cautiously. "It means," Damien said, walking back toward his desk and picking up his phone, "that starting tomorrow, you and Leo will move into the main house. Not the staff quarters. The main house. I want my son close to me, and I want you somewhere I can ensure you are both protected from whatever games my aunt believes she is still entitled to play." Elena stood quickly, alarm flashing across her face. "Damien, that is too fast. People will talk. Leo does not even understand who you are yet. Not really. We need time." "We have already lost 5 years," Damien said, his voice firm but not unkind. "I am not asking you to marry me tomorrow. I am not asking you to pretend we have a relationship we do not have. I am asking you to allow me to be present in my son's life, safely, without either of you living under threats any longer. Can you understand the difference?" Elena hesitated, torn between the instinct to protect her independence and the undeniable relief of no longer carrying this burden entirely alone. "I need to think," she finally said. "Take the night," Damien said. "But Elena, I want you to know something. Whatever happened 5 years ago, whatever fear my family caused you, I intend to spend as long as it takes making it right. Leo deserves a father who is present, and you deserve to stop looking over your shoulder." Elena left the study that night with her mind spinning, uncertain of what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in 5 years, she did not feel entirely alone in facing it. Meanwhile, in another wing of the mansion, Regina Cross sat in her private sitting room, sipping tea, with a calm, practiced elegance that masked the sharp attention she paid to every piece of information flowing through the house. A member of the household staff, loyal to her for reasons of their own, had just informed her of the events unfolding in Damien's study. Regina set down her teacup slowly, her expression unreadable. "So," she murmured to herself, "the maid's child has finally found his father. She had spent 5 years believing the problem permanently handled. She had underestimated a mother's determination once. She would not make the same mistake of underestimating the situation again. Whatever it took, Regina intended to ensure that history did not repeat itself in a way that threatened everything she had worked to secure for the family name. The battle, she decided, was far from over. It had only just begun. Elena did not sleep that night. She sat by the small window of the staff quarters, watching the moon travel slowly across the sky, while memories she had spent years trying to forget rose to the surface with painful clarity. She remembered the rainstorm as if it had happened yesterday instead of 5 years ago. She had been walking home from a long shift at a small bakery, her umbrella nearly useless against the wind, when she ducked under the shelter of a bus stop to escape the worst of the downpour. A man was already there, drenched from head to toe, his dark hair plastered against his forehead, his suit jacket soaked through and clinging uselessly to his shoulders. He had looked so out of place, standing there in expensive clothing ruined by the rain, that she had laughed before she could stop herself. "I am sorry," she had said quickly, embarrassed by her own reaction. "You just look like you were not expecting this at all." "I was not," he had admitted, a small, surprised smile breaking across his face, as if laughter itself were unfamiliar to him. "I had an umbrella. It turned inside out the moment I stepped outside." "Mine did the same thing about 10 minutes ago," she had said, holding up the mangled remains of her own umbrella as proof. They had laughed together then, two strangers soaked to the bone, sharing a small, ridiculous moment of connection in the middle of a storm neither of them had planned for. What began as simple conversation about the terrible weather slowly deepened into something else entirely. He told her about his dream of designing buildings that made people feel less alone, structures with warm light and open spaces that invited human connection instead of isolating people behind cold walls. She told him about her hope of one day opening a small bakery of her own, filled with the smell of fresh bread and the sound of easy conversation. Neither of them had asked the other's name. It had felt unnecessary at the time, almost as if naming the moment would somehow diminish its strange, unexpected magic. They had walked together after the rain finally slowed, ending up at a small 24-hour diner where they talked until the earliest hours of the morning, and eventually, inevitably, spent the rest of that night together, wrapped in a connection that felt far too real for two people who had known each other for only a few hours. In the morning, she had woken to find him gone, a hurried note left on the pillow beside her, explaining that a family emergency had called him away, and that he would return as soon as he could. She had waited. Days passed, then weeks, and he never returned. She told herself he had simply changed his mind, that the connection she felt so strongly had meant far less to him than it had meant to her. She had not known, not for a very long time, just how true and how false that assumption had been. Now, 5 years later, sitting in a small room in the very mansion belonging to the man from that rainy night, Elena understood something she had not fully allowed herself to understand before. Damien Cross had not abandoned her by choice. He had been called away by genuine tragedy, his mother's sudden collapse, and by the time he might have returned to search for her, his own family had already begun ensuring that path remained permanently closed. The unfairness of it settled over her like a heavy blanket, pressing the breath from her lungs. 5 years of loneliness, of fear, of scraping together enough money to keep her son fed and clothed, all because a woman with too much power and too little conscience had decided Elena was not good enough to be part of the Cross family's story. By morning, exhaustion had worn away most of her hesitation. She dressed Leo carefully, brushing his hair the way he liked, and made her way toward the main house, before her nerves could talk her out of the decision she had made sometime in the darkest hour of the night. Damien was already awake, seated at the long dining table with a cup of coffee he had not yet touched, clearly waiting for her. "I have decided," Elena said before he could speak, Leo's small hand still wrapped in hers. "We will move into the main house. But I want conditions." Something in Damien's expression eased slightly, relief mixing with the careful attentiveness of a man determined not to make another mistake. "Tell me your conditions." "I keep my job," Elena said firmly. "Not as a maid, perhaps, since that would be strange now. But I want something meaningful to do. I did not spend 5 years building independence just to lose it because of a change in circumstances." "Agreed," Damien said without hesitation. There are positions within the company that would suit your skills. I understand you managed the finances for the bakery you worked at before this job. We could certainly use someone with that kind of careful attention to detail." Elena blinked, surprised he had bothered to learn that much about her background already. "You looked into my history?" "I looked into everything the moment I suspected Leo might be mine," Damien admitted. "I needed to understand who was raising him, and what kind of woman had managed to keep him safe and happy despite everything working against her." Elena did not know how to respond to that, so she continued instead. "Second condition. Leo does not learn about any of this too quickly. He is 5 years old. He does not need to understand inheritance, or company politics, or dangerous ants plotting in the shadows. He simply needs to know that his father loves him and wants to spend time with him. Everything else can wait until he is older." "Agreed again," Damien said. "I have no intention of overwhelming him with things he is too young to process." "And third," Elena said, her voice softening slightly, though her eyes remained steady on his. "I need you to understand that I am not moving into this house because I expect anything more than what we agreed to last night. This is about Leo. It is not about us." Something flickered across Damien's face, quickly hidden, though not quickly enough for Elena to miss entirely. "Understood," he said simply. "This is about Leo." But even as he said the words, some part of him, the same part that had frozen in that hallway 2 days earlier, wondered quietly whether that would remain entirely true for either of them. The move happened quickly. By that afternoon, Elena and Leo had been settled into a spacious guest suite on the second floor of the main house, far grander than anything Elena had ever lived in before. Leo, delighted by the enormous bed and the window overlooking the garden, bounced happily from room to room, entirely unaware of the complicated tangle of emotions surrounding his sudden change in circumstances. Damien made a point of joining them for dinner that evening, something Elena suspected he rarely did, given the demands of running a company as large as Cross Industries. He sat across from Leo, asking careful questions about the boy's favorite foods, his favorite games, the stories he liked to hear before bed. Leo, initially shy, gradually warmed to the attention, chattering happily about dinosaurs and his favorite cartoon characters, while Damien listened with an intensity that suggested he was memorizing every word. Elena watched them together, and despite everything, despite the fear still lingering at the edges of her mind, she felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for 5 long years. Across the mansion, however, Regina Cross was not idle. She had spent the day making calls, gathering information, assessing the situation, with the same cold precision she applied to every business decision she had ever made. She learned of the DNA test Damien had quietly requested through a trusted lab, learned of Elena's move into the main house, learned that her nephew appeared fully committed to acknowledging the child as his heir. This could not be allowed to continue unchecked. Regina had built her position within the Cross family over decades of careful maneuvering, ensuring that her influence over company decisions remained strong, even after her brother's passing left control officially in Damien's hands. A sudden heir, born to a woman with no social standing, no business acumen, and no family connections of consequence, threatened to undo years of careful positioning. Worse, if Damien ever discovered the full extent of what she had done 5 years ago, the consequences for her position within the family, and potentially within the company itself, could be severe. She needed a plan, and she needed it quickly. That evening, she placed a call to a woman she had not spoken to in several years, a woman named Vivian, who had once been seriously considered as a suitable match for Damien before circumstances, and Damien's own stubborn independence, had ended that possibility. "Vivian," Regina said smoothly, when the call connected, "I believe we may have a mutual interest worth discussing." On the other end of the line, Vivian's voice sharpened with sudden attention. She had never fully let go of her ambitions regarding Damien Cross, nor the lifestyle and influence that came attached to his name. "I am listening," she said. "There is a situation developing," Regina continued, "that threatens both of our interests. I believe, working together, we might find a way to resolve it before it becomes permanent." Vivian smiled slowly into the darkness of her own apartment, several floors above the city that Damien Cross's company practically owned. "Tell me everything," she said. And so, while Damien and Elena took their first tentative steps toward building something resembling a family for Leo's sake, The forces determined to tear that fragile beginning apart had already begun quietly gathering their strength, waiting patiently for the perfect moment to strike. 2 weeks passed, and Elena slowly began to adjust to her strange new life within the walls of the Cross Mansion. Each morning, she reported to a small office on the third floor of Cross Industries headquarters, where she had been given a position helping manage the finances of the company's charitable foundation, a role that suited her careful, detail-oriented nature perfectly. Each evening, she returned home, to find Leo already halfway through some new adventure, whether it was learning to identify constellations from a book Damien had bought him, or building elaborate towers out of blocks in the study, while Damien pretended to work, but mostly watched with quiet fascination. Damien had changed, though he did not fully realize it himself. His assistant Marcus noticed it first, the way meetings that once ran until midnight now ended promptly enough for Damien to make it home in time for dinner, the way his usually sharp and impatient tone had softened, at least when Leo's name came up in conversation. "You are different," Marcus observed one afternoon, as they reviewed quarterly reports in Damien's office. "I have a son," Damien said simply, as if that explained everything, which in many ways it did. Marcus smiled but said nothing further, though privately he was relieved to see his employer, and if he was honest, his friend, finally showing signs of the warmth that years of business pressure and family expectation had slowly worn away. Elena, for her part, found herself caught between gratitude and caution. Damien had kept every promise he made. She still worked, still maintained her independence, and Leo was thriving in ways she had never quite been able to provide on her own, surrounded by books, by space to run and play, by a father who seemed determined to make up for lost time in every possible way. And yet, she could not fully relax. The fear that Regina had planted in her years ago still lingered beneath the surface, a quiet, persistent worry that this happiness was too fragile, too new, to be trusted completely. Her instincts, unfortunately, proved correct. It began subtly, the way most dangerous things do. A photographer, positioned just outside the gates of the mansion, managed to capture a picture of Elena and Leo walking together in the garden. Within a day, the image appeared in a gossip column, accompanied by a headline speculating about the mysterious woman and child who had suddenly taken up residence with the notoriously private Alpha King of Cross Industries. Elena felt sick reading it, though Damien assured her the media attention would fade quickly once the initial curiosity died down. It did not fade. If anything, it intensified, as more articles appeared, each one containing details that seemed suspiciously accurate for information that should not have been public. Someone was leaking information, and Elena had a sinking feeling she knew exactly who. The confirmation came a week later, when Elena received an unexpected visitor at her office. A woman she did not recognize, elegant and sharp-featured, entered without an appointment, closing the door firmly behind her. "Ms. Voss," the woman said, her voice smooth and pleasant in a way that immediately put Elena on edge. "My name is Vivian. I believe we should talk." Elena's hands went still on her keyboard. "I do not believe we have anything to discuss." "Oh, I think we do," Vivian said, settling into the chair across from Elena's desk without invitation. "You see, I have known Damien for many years, long before you appeared in his life with your convenient story about a rainy night and a forgotten name." "It is not a story," Elena said, keeping her voice steady, despite the anger rising in her chest. "It is the truth, and Damien has confirmed it himself." "Truth is a flexible thing," Vivian said with a small, cold smile, "especially when a struggling single mother suddenly finds herself living in a mansion, working a comfortable job, with access to more money than she has ever seen in her life. People will wonder, Miss Voss, whether the child's paternity was truly discovered by accident, or whether it was engineered rather cleverly by a woman desperate enough to secure her own future." Elena's jaw tightened. The DNA test confirmed everything. There is no question about who Leo's father is. "Tests can be manipulated," Vivian said smoothly, though something in her tone suggested even she did not fully believe that claim. "And even if the child is genuinely his, that does not mean you belong in this family, or that Damien's judgment in this matter should be trusted entirely. He is, after all, a man who allowed his emotions to override careful thinking. That tends to happen when convenient children with dimpled smiles appear out of nowhere." "What do you want?" Elena asked directly, tired of the veiled threats, disguised as casual conversation. Vivian's smile sharpened. I want you to consider your position carefully, Ms. Voss. Damien Cross is a busy, important man, with an empire to protect. Scandals involving questionable paternity claims and gold-digging maids do not sit well with shareholders or business partners. If you truly care about Leo's well-being, perhaps you should consider whether staying in this house, under this kind of scrutiny, is truly the safest choice for him. Are you threatening me? Elena asked, her voice low and dangerous in a way that surprised even herself. I am simply offering perspective, Vivian said, standing gracefully and smoothing her expensive skirt. Think about it, Ms. Voss. A quiet exit now, with appropriate compensation of course, would spare everyone a great deal of unnecessary difficulty. I would hate to see things become messier than they need to be. She left without waiting for a response, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor as she departed, leaving Elena alone with her racing heart and a familiar sickening sense of déjà vu. This was not the first time someone had tried to buy her silence, tried to convince her that disappearing quietly was the safest and easiest option available. She had run once before, driven by fear and a lack of resources to fight back. This time, she reminded herself, things were different. This time, she was not alone. That evening, she told Damien everything, watching his expression darken with each detail she shared. Vivian, he said, his voice tight with restrained fury. Of course. She has never fully accepted that I chose not to pursue a relationship with her years ago. And working alongside my aunt would explain how information has been leaking to the press. She threatened me, Elena said. Not directly, but the message was clear enough. She wants me gone, and I suspect Regina wants the same thing. Damien's expression hardened into something Elena had not seen before. A quiet, controlled anger that reminded her, briefly, of exactly why people referred to him as the Alpha King. They will not succeed, he said firmly. I made you a promise, that you and Leo would be protected, and I intend to keep it, regardless of what games my aunt and Vivian believe they can play. But I need you to trust me, Elena. Whatever happens next, I need you to stay, not run. Elena looked at him carefully, searching his face for any sign of doubt, any hesitation that might suggest his resolve would eventually crumble under enough pressure. She found none. I am done running, she said finally. I ran once, and it cost me 5 years. I can never get back. I will not make that mistake again. Something shifted between them in that moment, a quiet understanding that went beyond simple co-parenting arrangements or careful business agreements. Whatever complicated feelings still lingered from that rainy night 5 years ago, whatever fear and uncertainty had built walls between them since, neither of them was willing to let outside forces destroy the fragile family they were slowly, carefully building. The battle lines had been drawn, and this time, Elena intended to stand her ground. The official DNA results arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning, delivered in a plain envelope that Marcus placed on Damien's desk without comment. Damien had already known the truth in his heart, had known it from the moment Leo's small arms wrapped around his legs in that hallway, but seeing the confirmation in writing still struck him with unexpected force. He read the report twice, his eyes lingering on the percentage that left no room for doubt. 99.9% probability of paternity. Leo was, without question, his son. He sat alone in his office for several minutes afterward, simply staring out at the city skyline, feeling the full weight of 5 stolen years pressing against his chest. Somewhere across that skyline, his son had taken his first steps without him, had spoken his first words without him, had celebrated birthdays, learned to read, fallen asleep afraid of thunderstorms, all without a father present to comfort him. The grief surprised him, sharp and unexpected, mixing uncomfortably with the anger he still carried toward his aunt's interference. But beneath both emotions ran something steadier, something that felt almost like determination. He could not reclaim the years already lost, but he could ensure that every year going forward belonged fully to his son, without interruption, without hiding, without fear. That evening, he called a private meeting with his lawyers, setting in motion the legal process of formally acknowledging Leo as his son and heir. It was not a decision made lightly, nor one made purely from sentiment. Damien understood the implications clearly. Once made public, this acknowledgement would reshape the entire structure of Cross Industries, altering inheritance plans that had existed for years, and inevitably, drawing intense scrutiny from every corner of the business world and beyond. He did not care. Leo deserved recognition, protection, and a place in the family that had, through no fault of his own, initially tried to erase his existence entirely. He informed Elena of his decision the following morning, watching her expression shift through surprise, concern, and finally cautious acceptance as he explained the legal steps already underway. "This will change everything," Elena said quietly, sitting across from him in the study that had become the unofficial meeting place for their most important conversations. "Once this becomes public, there will be no going back. People will scrutinize every detail of our lives." Leo's life. "I know," Damien said, "but hiding him, protecting him through secrecy rather than strength, has already cost us 5 years. I will not continue building his life around fear. He deserves better than that, and so do you." Elena studied him carefully, searching for any hint of hesitation, finding instead only quiet, unwavering resolve. "All right," she finally said, "but I want to be part of these decisions, Damien, not simply informed after the fact. If this affects Leo's life so significantly, I need a voice in how it unfolds." "Agreed," Damien said without hesitation. "You have always had a voice in this. I intend to make sure the rest of the world understands that as clearly as I do." The public announcement came 2 weeks later, delivered through a carefully worded press release, accompanied by a brief, dignified statement from Damien himself, acknowledging Leo as his biological son, and formally announcing that the boy would be recognized as heir to the Cross family legacy. The statement made no mention of the circumstances surrounding Leo's early years, out of respect for both Elena's privacy and Leo's own well-being, but it left absolutely no ambiguity regarding Damien's intentions moving forward. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. News outlets scrambled to cover the story from every possible angle. Business analysts speculated endlessly about what the announcement meant for the future direction of Cross Industries. Society columns buzzed with questions about the mysterious mother who had somehow captured, and apparently kept, the attention of the notoriously private Alpha King. Elena found the sudden attention deeply uncomfortable, though she did her best to shield Leo from most of it, keeping him away from public outings whenever possible, relying on Marta and other trusted household staff to help maintain some semblance of normal routine amid the chaos unfolding around them. Regina Cross, watching the announcement unfold from her private sitting room, felt something cold settle deep in her chest. She had underestimated her nephew's resolve once before, believing money and fear would be enough to permanently remove the inconvenient complication of Elena and her child. She would not make that mistake twice, but the public nature of this announcement complicated matters significantly. Whatever she did next would need to be careful, deniable, and executed with far greater precision than her previous attempts. She placed another call to Vivian that same evening. "The situation has escalated," Regina said, her voice tight with controlled frustration. "Damien has made the acknowledgement public. Undoing this quietly is no longer an option." "Then we adjust our approach," Vivian said smoothly. "If we cannot remove the child quietly, we discredit the mother publicly. Plant enough doubt about her character, her motives, her fitness as a parent, and the public will do the rest of our work for us. Damien's board will pressure him to reconsider the situation, regardless of what his heart wants." Regina considered this carefully. It was a riskier strategy than her original plan, but circumstances demanded adaptation. "What did you have in mind?" "Leave that to me," Vivian said, a slow, calculating smile spreading across her face as she began piecing together the details of a plan that would soon threaten to unravel everything Damien and Elena had worked so carefully to build. Over the following weeks, small, damaging stories began appearing in various publications, each one carefully crafted to plant seeds of doubt in the public's mind. Anonymous sources claimed Elena had a history of financial instability, conveniently ignoring the circumstances that had caused it. Other stories hinted, without directly stating, that Elena had known exactly who Damien was from the very beginning, suggesting the entire situation had been carefully orchestrated, rather than the result of genuine circumstance. Elena read each article with a growing sense of dread, watching helplessly as strangers online began forming opinions about her character, based entirely on fabricated narratives, designed to destroy her credibility. "None of this is true," she said to Damien one evening, after a particularly damaging article suggested she had deliberately targeted him for his wealth. "How can people believe things so easily that have absolutely no basis in reality?" "Because that is exactly what these stories are designed to do," Damien said grimly, closing his laptop with more force than necessary. "They do not need to be true. They only need to create enough doubt that people begin questioning the truth we already know." "What do we do?" Elena asked, exhaustion evident in her voice after weeks of mounting pressure. Damien's expression hardened with quiet determination. "We fight back. Carefully, strategically, and with proof rather than emotion. I have already begun looking into where these stories are originating from. Someone is feeding false information to these publications, and I intend to find out exactly who." He did not have to look far. Within days, his private investigators uncovered a clear pattern, connecting several of the damaging articles back to conversations held between Vivian and specific journalists, known for prioritizing sensational stories over factual accuracy. More troubling still, financial records revealed unusual transfers from an account connected to Regina, transfers that closely matched the timing of several published stories. The evidence was mounting, and soon, Damien intended to use every piece of it. But Regina and Vivian, sensing perhaps that their carefully constructed narrative was beginning to lose its grip on public opinion, decided it was time to escalate their plan dramatically, choosing a moment when the maximum number of influential people would be present to witness Elena's downfall firsthand. The company's annual charity gala, scheduled just 3 weeks away, would provide the perfect stage for their final, decisive move. Regina did not act alone in the days leading up to the gala. She met with Vivian twice more, refining every detail of their plan with the same careful precision Regina had once applied to negotiating business deals worth hundreds of millions. This time, however, the stakes felt far more personal, and that personal investment made her sharper, more focused, and considerably more dangerous. "The board members will all be present," Regina explained during their final planning session, seated in a private corner of an exclusive restaurant, far from prying eyes. "Several major investors as well. If we can plant sufficient doubt about the child's paternity, or better yet, about Elena's fitness as a mother, in front of that particular audience, the pressure on Damien to reconsider this entire situation will become impossible to ignore." "And if Damien refuses to back down regardless?" Vivian asked, sipping her wine thoughtfully. "Then the board will do what boards always do when a company's reputation is threatened," Regina said with cold satisfaction. "They will apply pressure through other channels. Damien may be stubborn, but even he cannot ignore unified opposition from every major stakeholder in the company his own father built." Vivian nodded slowly, satisfaction settling across her sharp features. "I have already arranged for a journalist to attend, someone with a reputation for asking uncomfortable questions in public settings. If Elena becomes flustered, if she hesitates even slightly when confronted publicly, the resulting coverage will do exactly what we need it to do." Their plan seemed foolproof, at least from where they sat, confident in their years of combined experience manipulating public perception and business outcomes to serve their own interests. What they failed to fully account for, however, was the extent to which Damien Cross had already begun preparing his own countermeasures. Damien had spent the weeks leading up to the gala working closely with his legal team and private investigators, compiling an ironclad case that documented everything: the original threats made against Elena 5 years earlier, the financial transfers linking Regina to the damaging press coverage, and detailed records proving Vivian's direct involvement in coordinating the smear campaign against Elena's character. He shared none of this with Elena immediately, wanting to spare her additional stress during an already difficult period, but he made absolutely certain that by the night of the gala, every piece of evidence needed to dismantle his aunt's scheme sat ready and waiting, prepared for exactly the kind of public confrontation he suspected Regina intended to orchestrate. The evening of the gala arrived with a tension that Elena could feel humming beneath her skin from the moment she began getting ready. She stood in front of the mirror in the guest suite, wearing an elegant deep blue gown that Damien had insisted on providing, though she had initially resisted the gesture, uncomfortable with accepting yet another expensive gift from a man whose generosity still felt strange and unfamiliar after years of careful independence. "You look beautiful," Damien said from the doorway, watching her with an expression she found increasingly difficult to interpret these days, something warmer, more personal, than the careful co-parenting arrangement they had originally established. "I am terrified," Elena admitted honestly, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her dress with trembling hands. "Everyone will be watching us tonight, judging us." "Let them watch," Damien said, crossing the room to stand beside her, his reflection joining hers in the mirror. "Let them judge. By the end of tonight, they will understand exactly who deserves that judgment, and it will not be you." Elena turned to face him, searching his expression for reassurance. "You have a plan." "I have proof," Damien said simply. "Whatever my aunt and Vivian have arranged for tonight, I am prepared for it. I need you to trust me, and I need you to remain calm, no matter what happens or what accusations get thrown your way. Can you do that?" Elena took a deep, steadying breath, drawing on reserves of strength she had built over 5 difficult years of facing uncertainty alone. "Yes," she said firmly, "I can do that." They arrived at the gala together, walking into the grand ballroom hand in hand, presenting a united front to the assembled crowd of business leaders, socialites, and members of the press who had gathered specifically to witness this highly anticipated public appearance following weeks of speculation and rumor. Leo remained safely at home with Marta and Marcus, far removed from whatever unfolded that evening, a decision both Damien and Elena had agreed upon without hesitation. The evening began smoothly enough, with polite conversations and careful pleasantries exchanged among the city's elite. Elena felt the weight of curious stares following her throughout the room, but she held herself with a quiet dignity that surprised even herself, refusing to let discomfort show on her face despite the constant scrutiny. It was during the formal dinner portion of the evening, as guests settled into their assigned seats and conversation shifted toward more substantial topics, that Regina made her move. She rose gracefully from her seat, tapping her glass gently to draw attention, before Damien could object to the interruption. "I would like to propose a toast," Regina announced, her voice carrying easily across the quieted ballroom, "to new beginnings, and to the importance of truth within our family, however uncomfortable that truth may sometimes prove to be." A murmur of curious anticipation rippled through the crowd. Damien's expression sharpened immediately, recognizing the calculated nature of his aunt's carefully staged interruption. "Regina," he said quietly, a warning evident in his tone. "Let me finish, dear nephew," Regina said smoothly, her smile never wavering, despite the tension building visibly between them. "I simply believe that a family as prominent as ours owes a certain transparency to the shareholders and partners who have trusted us for generations. Particularly when significant decisions, such as the sudden acknowledgement of an heir, are made based on claims that have not been thoroughly, publicly verified." Elena felt her stomach drop, understanding immediately what her aunt intended to accomplish. Around the room, several journalists who had positioned themselves strategically began quietly recording, sensing the confrontation building towards something significant. "The DNA results have already been confirmed through an accredited laboratory," Damien said calmly, though his eyes had hardened considerably. "There is no ambiguity regarding Leo's paternity." "Perhaps not regarding paternity," Vivian added smoothly, rising from her own seat near the front of the room, clearly having coordinated this moment carefully with Regina beforehand. "But questions certainly remain regarding the mother's character, and whether her sudden appearance in your life, immediately following your rise to full control of the company, was truly as coincidental as she claims." Elena's hands clenched beneath the table, her heart hammering wildly, but she forced herself to remain outwardly composed, remembering Damien's earlier words. Whatever accusations came, she would face them with calm dignity rather than panic. "That is a serious accusation," Damien said, his voice cutting sharply through the murmuring crowd. "One I would advise you consider very carefully before continuing, Vivian, given the evidence I currently possess regarding your involvement in coordinating false stories about Elena over these past several weeks." The room fell into stunned silence. Vivian's confident expression faltered slightly, though she quickly recovered. "I have no idea what you are referring to." "Do you not?" Damien asked, nodding toward Marcus, who stood near the entrance of the ballroom, and immediately began distributing carefully prepared documents to several key board members and journalists seated throughout the room. "These documents," Damien continued, his voice steady and commanding, carrying the same authority that had earned him the nickname Alpha King throughout the business world, Detail financial transfers made from an account connected to my aunt, timed precisely alongside the publication of several damaging, entirely fabricated articles about Elena's character over these past weeks. They also detail communications between Vivian and specific journalists, coordinating the exact framing and timing of that same false coverage. Gasps rippled through the crowd as attendees began reviewing the documents in their hands. Regina's composed expression finally cracked, replaced by something colder and far more calculating. "You cannot possibly prove these were connected to any intentional scheme," Regina said sharply, though the confidence in her voice had noticeably diminished. "Actually," Damien said, "I can. Because these documents also include records from 5 years ago, financial transfers made to a woman matching Elena's description, attempted bribery intended to ensure her silence and permanent disappearance, along with recorded threats made against her family, should she ever attempt to contact me after our initial meeting." The room erupted into stunned murmurs. Elena felt tears prick at her eyes, not from fear this time, but from the overwhelming relief of finally hearing the truth she had carried alone for 5 years, spoken openly, in front of the very people who had once dismissed her as unworthy. "5 years ago," Damien continued, his voice growing louder, carrying the full weight of restrained fury he had held carefully in check for weeks, "my aunt decided that Elena was not good enough to be part of this family. She threatened a frightened, pregnant young woman into disappearing, denying my son and me 5 years together that we can never reclaim. And when that scheme threatened to unravel following our reunion, she and Vivian orchestrated a coordinated campaign of lies, attempting to discredit Elena publicly, rather than accept responsibility for their own actions." Regina's face had gone pale, though she attempted, unsuccessfully, to maintain some semblance of composure, under the weight of dozens of shocked stares, now directed entirely toward her. "This is a misunderstanding," she said weakly, though even she seemed to recognize the futility of continuing the denial. "It is not," Damien said firmly, "and effective immediately, given the evidence presented tonight. I am formally removing you from any position of authority within Cross Industries, pending a full internal investigation into your conduct." The board members present, having reviewed the documentation now spread across their tables, exchanged grave glances, several already nodding in silent agreement with Damien's decision. Vivian, recognizing the situation had spiraled entirely beyond her control, attempted a hasty retreat toward the exit, only to find her path blocked by hotel security, quietly summoned by Marcus earlier that evening in anticipation of exactly this kind of confrontation. Elena stood slowly from her seat, her legs trembling slightly, but her voice steady and clear as she finally spoke to the room that had spent weeks judging her character based on lies. "I did not choose this life for wealth or status," she said, her voice carrying easily across the now silent ballroom. "I chose it because Leo deserves to know his father, and because I refuse to let fear dictate my choices any longer. Everything said about me these past weeks has been a lie, carefully constructed to protect the people responsible for stealing 5 years of my son's life." Applause began slowly, hesitantly at first, then spreading across the room as attendees who had arrived skeptical found themselves genuinely moved by the quiet strength and dignity Elena displayed in the face of such calculated cruelty. Regina was escorted from the ballroom shortly afterward, her once secure position within the family and company now thoroughly, publicly dismantled. Vivian followed soon after, her reputation among the city's elite irreparably damaged by the evening's revelations. As the crowd slowly returned to their conversations, buzzing with the shock of everything they had witnessed, Damien turned to Elena, taking her trembling hands gently in his own. "It is finally over," he said softly. "No more hiding, no more fear." Elena felt tears finally spill down her cheeks, though this time, they carried relief rather than sorrow. "It is over," she agreed quietly. For the first time since that rainy night 5 years ago, Elena allowed herself to believe, fully and completely, that the life she had once dreamed of, safe, honest, and full of love, might finally be within reach. The weeks following the gala brought a kind of quiet Elena had almost forgotten was possible. The damaging articles that had once flooded every corner of the internet were quickly followed by corrections, apologies, and entirely new coverage, praising her strength and composure in the face of what reporters now openly called a calculated campaign of cruelty, orchestrated by two powerful women who had underestimated her resolve. Regina's removal from Cross Industries proceeded exactly as Damien had promised, the internal investigation confirming not only her involvement in the recent smear campaign, but also uncovering additional evidence of her original threats made against Elena 5 years earlier. Facing potential legal consequences, alongside the complete collapse of her business reputation, Regina quietly relocated abroad, her once formidable influence over the Cross family reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale whispered occasionally in business circles. Vivian fared little better. Stripped of the social connections she had spent years carefully cultivating, she found herself increasingly isolated, her name now permanently associated with the scandal that had briefly threatened to unravel Damien and Elena's fragile new family. For Elena, the sense of freedom that followed felt almost overwhelming after 5 years of constant vigilance. She no longer flinched at unexpected knocks on the door. She no longer lay awake at night, calculating escape routes or backup plans should danger suddenly resurface. For the first time since that rainy night so long ago, she allowed herself to simply exist, present and unafraid, in the life she had built. Leo thrived amid the newfound stability, his bond with Damien deepening with each passing week. Father and son had developed a comfortable rhythm together, spending weekend mornings exploring the extensive gardens surrounding the mansion, evenings curled together on the study sofa, while Damien read bedtime stories, in a voice that had grown remarkably gentle compared to the commanding tone he used in boardrooms. "Daddy," Leo said one evening, testing the word with the easy confidence only children possess, as though he had been using it his entire life, rather than only these past few months. "Can we build a fort tomorrow? A really big one?" "The biggest fort this house has ever seen," Damien promised, tucking the blankets carefully around his son, feeling a warmth settle in his chest that had nothing to do with business success or financial achievement, and everything to do with this simple, precious moment of ordinary family life he had once feared he might never experience. Elena watched from the doorway, her heart full in a way that still occasionally caught her by surprise. She had spent so many years believing that safety and happiness were luxuries reserved for other people, other families, other lives, entirely different from her own difficult circumstances. Watching Damien tuck their son into bed, watching Leo's face light up with pure, uncomplicated joy at the promise of tomorrow's adventures, she finally allowed herself to believe that perhaps happiness had simply been waiting patiently for her to stop running long enough to find it. Damien noticed her standing there and crossed the room quietly, careful not to disturb Leo, who had already begun drifting towards sleep. "Walk with me," he said softly, extending his hand. They made their way down to the garden, the night air cool and pleasant, stars scattered brightly across a clear sky above them. They walked in comfortable silence for several minutes, the kind of silence that no longer felt heavy with unspoken tension, but rather settled and peaceful, the natural quiet shared between two people who had weathered significant difficulty together and emerged stronger for it. "I have been thinking," Damien finally said, stopping beside a small stone bench overlooking the garden's central fountain, "about everything that has happened these past months, about everything we lost, and everything we have somehow managed to find despite it." Elena turned to face him, curious about where this conversation might lead. "What have you been thinking?" "I have been thinking that I do not want to simply co-parent Leo alongside you," Damien said, his voice steady, despite the evident vulnerability in his expression. "I have been thinking that the connection we shared that rainy night, 5 years ago, never truly disappeared, not for me. It simply waited, buried beneath circumstances neither of us controlled, for the chance to grow into something real." Elena's breath caught, her heart racing as she processed the weight of what he was saying. "Damien, I am not asking because of Leo," he continued quickly, wanting to be absolutely clear. "I am not asking out of obligation, or convenience, or any sense of duty toward providing him a traditional family structure. I am asking because these past months, watching you rebuild your life with such quiet strength, watching you fight for our son with such fierce dedication, I have fallen in love with you all over again, perhaps even more deeply than I did during that single unforgettable night we shared." He reached into his pocket, producing a small velvet box that Elena had not noticed him carrying, and knelt slowly before her, the stars above reflecting softly in his eyes. "Elena Voss," he said, his voice carrying quiet, unwavering sincerity. I know we have not walked a conventional path toward this moment. I know there is still much we need to learn about each other, much healing still required after everything my family put you through, but I do not want to waste another single day pretending that what I feel for you is anything less than love. Will you marry me? Tears streamed freely down Elena's cheeks as she looked down at him. 5 years of fear, loneliness, and quiet strength finally giving way to overwhelming joy. Yes, she whispered, then laughed through her tears, repeating the word louder, with complete certainty. Yes, Damien, I will marry you. He rose to meet her, sliding the ring gently onto her finger, before pulling her into an embrace that held within it every unspoken emotion, from 5 long years apart, and every hopeful promise for the years still waiting ahead of them. Their wedding took place several months later, a quiet, intimate ceremony held in the very garden where Damien had proposed, surrounded only by close friends, trusted staff who had supported them throughout their journey, and Leo, who insisted on wearing his favorite dinosaur bow tie despite Elena's gentle suggestions toward something more traditional. As Elena walked down the flower-lined path toward Damien, she caught sight of Leo standing proudly beside his father, holding the rings with the serious concentration only a 5-year-old entrusted with an important task could manage. Damien's eyes, usually so carefully guarded during business dealings, shone openly with emotion as he watched her approach, the cold, untouchable Alpha King entirely absent, replaced instead by a man simply, deeply in love. Later that evening, as the last of their guests departed and the garden settled into peaceful quiet beneath a canopy of stars, Elena found herself standing once again beside the fountain where everything had truly begun, Damien's arm wrapped securely around her waist, Leo already fast asleep against his father's shoulder after a day filled with excitement and celebration. "Do you remember," Elena asked softly, "what you told me that very first night, at the bus stop, before either of us knew each other's names?" Damien smiled, the memory clearly as vivid for him as it remained for her. "I told you I wanted to build places that made people feel less alone." "You did," Elena said, leaning her head against his shoulder, watching their son sleep peacefully in his father's arms. "You built exactly that, right here, without even realizing it." Damien pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head, holding his family close beneath the quiet night sky. 5 years of separation, 5 years of fear and hidden struggle, had finally given way to something neither of them had dared hope for during those darkest, loneliest years apart. A home, a family, a love strong enough to survive every obstacle placed deliberately in its path. And as Leo stirred slightly in his sleep, murmuring the word "Daddy," with the easy, unshakable confidence of a child who had never once doubted, not even for a single moment, exactly where he belonged, Damien and Elena understood, with complete and quiet certainty, that whatever difficulties life might still bring their way, they would face them together, as the family they had always been meant to become.